Hello everyone, I hope you are doing well today. I apologize, I did not have the opportunity to record a video yesterday because I was moving to my new apartment, so it kept me a bit busy. But today, I'd like to say a few words about the very first thing that we study in economics in most curricula. The first thing that we study is the fundamental economics problem, the relationship between scarce resources and unlimited ones. And there are a few things that I think are interesting about this fundamental economic problem, and I'd like to share my views about these points. The first thing that seems interesting to me is the difference between a resource and a factor of production. Usually I ask my students, do you think this is the same? Can we just use the word resource or factor of production? Do they have the same meaning? And the answer is no, this is not exactly the same thing. A resource is anything that you can use to produce something else. It's an input in a production process. And the factor of production, it's not really a resource in itself. It's a category of resource. It's a group of resource, a type of resource. There are hundreds of thousands of different resources, but there are only four different factor of production. So it's one way to organize all the different resources that we have into these four categories. Land. I don't really like this word land, but let's say natural resources, capital, labor, and enterprise. So basically, a factor of production is just a group or category of resource. Then there is something that we often say. We say that resources are limited, and sometimes students they try to find examples of resources that are unlimited. It's difficult to find examples because even when you think about it, sometimes the students they talk about air and they say air is unlimited, which is not true. The quantity of air that we have on Earth is limited. It's very big, but you can Google it if you want. It's possible to calculate the amount of air or the amount of oxygen that we have on the planet. So it's not unlimited, but it's very big. Even if you think of solar energy, same thing, it's very big, but it's not an infinite amount of energy. So then there is something that is interesting. It's a difference between a resource being limited and a resource being scarce, because again, to me, all resources are limited. Limited simply means that it's smaller than infinity. And in that case, when we understand limited this way, all resources are limited. Perhaps the only resource that might be unlimited, we don't really know yet, would be space. We don't know at this stage if space is limited or not, which is actually, I don't know, perhaps something that we will find out in the next decades or century. But for now, it's still something that we do not know. So a resource is limited if it's available in a finite amount. And then there's the difference between being limited and being scarce. A resource is scarce if we don't have enough. Enough for what? Enough to produce all the goods and services that we would like to produce with this resource. Uh, so limited is just about the quantity. Scarce is about the tension between how much we have and how much we want to use. Okay. So then, are all resources scarce? No, most of them are, but there are some examples of resources that are not, and air is a good example. Solar energy is also an example of a resource that is not scarce, not because it is unlimited, but simply because it's available in sufficient quantity to produce all the goods and services that we want out of this particular resource. And something that I often tell to my students, and I think it's interesting, is that scarcity is actually a relative concept. In particular, whether or not a resource is scarce mostly depends on time and location. And the best example that you can give them to illustrate that is the example of water. Water is scarce in some countries or in some areas. If you take the example of the most African countries, Central African countries, where the climate, where the weather is extremely dry, and water is definitely a scarce resource. We don't have enough to satisfy all the needs and wants that involve the use of water. But I realized during my last trip to New Zealand that in New Zealand, water is not scarce. It was raining all the time. So, well, you know what I mean. There are some areas where water is available in sufficient quantity to satisfy all the wants and needs that involve the use of water. So it depends on location, but it also depends on time. Water is likely to be scarce during summer in most countries. France, for example, water is scarce during the summer, and there are some regulations, some restrictions. So, for example, you are not allowed to water your garden when it's extremely dry, simply because we have to allocate water to the uses that seem the most important. And during, for example, spring or fall, water seems is usually not a scarce resource. I just think it's interesting to emphasize this fact. Scarcity is a relative concept. It does depend on many things, including time and location. Okay, now a few things about these full factors of production. Let's start with okay, land. Um, there are different type of natural resources, and I think it's interesting to help the students to distinguish between renewable natural resources and non-renewable natural resources, and we can give some examples. A renewable resource is simply one that has the ability to renew itself. That's it. A non-renewable resource is one whose stock is fixed. Okay, so a renewable resource, if you don't use it, the stock is likely to increase over time. A non-renewable resource, whatever you do with it, the stock is going to be fixed over a long period of time. And something that is actually quite interesting is that when you ask your students to give examples of non-renewable resources, many of them will tell you that oil is a non-renewable resource. Actually, it is a renewable resource, but the fact is that it takes a long time to renew itself. It takes millions of years for oil to renew itself, or for the stock of existing oil to increase. So it is renewable. It has the ability to renew itself, but simply because it's too slow, it's a process that is extremely slow, we consider that it is non-renewable over the time period that seems relevant to us. When we produce, we can't just say, yeah, it's okay, we'll wait millions of years for the stock of oil to be able to increase again. And to that extent, most natural resources are renewable, but when it takes millions of years for them to renew themselves, then for our relevant time horizon, we can see them as non-renewable. Okay, and then another difference that is important is the concept of sustainable resource, sustainable versus non-sustainable resource. So here the idea is a bit more interesting. Sustainable resources are resources that are renewable, but such that we do not use them too fast, so the stock of this resource is not going to diminish over time. And a non-sustainable resource is simply a resource that we use too fast. In particular, we use it faster than the rate at which it renews itself, so over time the stock will decrease. And the example that I often use with my students is that of a lake in which you have fish. And I say, okay, there is a lake, we have 100 fish, and every year there are 20 new fish that were born in this lake. But we have a fisherman, and this fisherman catches 10 fishes every year. Okay, so on the one hand, you have plus 20 fishes that were born naturally because they just reproduce themselves. It's a renewable resource. But on the other hand, you have this fisherman that catches 10 fishes per year. In this case, would we say that fish is a sustainable resource? It's a renewable resource, of course. Is this a sustainable resource? Yes, simply because the rate at which we catch the fish, at the rate at which we use the resource, is lower than the rate at which this resource can renew itself. But if we have like three fishermen now in the same lake, and each of them catches 10 fish, which means that every year 30 fishes are caught in this lake. And there's the rate at which they renew themselves, it's still 20 fish per year. In this case, is the resource sustainable? No, because the rate at which we use the resource is greater than the rate at which this resource can renew itself. Okay, so I think it's interesting for the students to understand this distinction between renewable, non-renewable, sustainable, non-sustainable. Then let's say a few words about capital. Capital is a tricky one because you know that there are different types of capital, and usually we can distinguish three types of capital. The one that we will be interested in economics, when we talk about capital, we talk about physical capital, machines, tools, factories, vehicles, equipment, all that, which are man-made resources that are used in a production process. And it's very important to remind the students, like very often, that when we talk about capital in economics, this is what we actually mean. Because some of them, especially those who also study business, when they hear capital, they don't think of physical capital, they actually think of financial capital. Financial capital, which is, to simplify, money. Okay, and of course we don't talk about that in economics. Money is not a resource, simply because money cannot be used to produce anything. Money is just something that makes economic transactions easier. If you have money, you can buy factors of production, but if you want to produce a car, you're not going to use money to produce a car. You will need steel, you will need a factory, you will need a machine, you will need engineers, you will need an entrepreneur, you will need factors of production. Money can help to purchase these factors of production, but money in itself does not create anything. So make sure that you insist that financial capital is not a resource. And then there is a last type of capital, which is actually going to be related to another factor of production, which is labor, which is human capital. Human capital is simply the stock of skills that the labor force has. So it's related to the productivity. It will have an influence on the productivity of the workers within your economy. Okay, what else should, yeah, what about time? This one is an interesting one, right? Is time a resource? Um, I would say that yes, it is. It's more like a condition. If you don't have time, you can't produce anything. Even if you have the example that I use with my students is when we produce knowledge in a classroom. Even if we have a teacher, we have a smart board, we have a director that organizes the factors of production. We have everything we need. We have elements of the four categories of factors of production to produce knowledge. But if instead of having a 45-minute lesson, if we only have 10 seconds, you see that we will not produce much knowledge. So time, in my opinion, should be considered a resource, or more like something that is a necessary condition for the factors of production to actually produce something. So then if we think of in which category should we classify it, what makes the most sense to me would be a natural resource, right? Time is not something that has been created by humans. It's not man-made. Um, so I would classify it as a natural resource that you need if you want to produce anything. It's impossible to produce anything if you have a very small amount of time. And finally, the last type of resource that I think is interesting is space. What about space in itself? Is this a resource in itself? And again, I think it is. I think this is something that is important when you have a field. Um, you can't grow anything if you just don't have space. If there is no more space, you can't increase the size of your fields, for example. So to that extent, I do believe that space should also be considered a resource. And same thing, in which category should we include it? Most likely as in the natural resources. We have not created space. We live on a planet whose size is given. Um, so yeah, time and space, to me, they should be considered natural resources. Same thing, if you don't have any space, you can't produce, you can't build a factory or anything like that. Okay. Then once we have said this about resources, a few words about decisions, because we know that the basic economic problem tells us that since most resources are scarce, we have to make decisions. And by the way, something that you can tell to your students is that every day we make on average 40,000 decisions. Micro decisions, of course, but psychologists, they have estimated that on average individuals, they make 40,000 decisions per day. Of course, these are not decisions like what am I going to do in the future, or should I, these are not like big decisions that will change your life, but micro decisions about what you do with your with your with your body language, what you're going to get for lunch, or these type of things. Even when you talk, every time you talk, every time you have to choose how you are going to articulate your sentences, you make many decisions, very like many small decisions, but these are decisions anyway. And we know that every time we make a decision, we have to give up something, and this gives rise to the concept of opportunity cost. And there are just two things that I want to say about the concept of opportunity cost, because I assume most of you are familiar about that. In many textbooks, in order to illustrate the concept of opportunity cost, they used a weird example. They use the example of money. They tell you, okay, you have $100, and okay, you can use this money to buy noodles, or you can use this money to buy, I don't know, video games. Well, when you think about it, since money is not a resource, I think we established that earlier, we should not, I don't think it's a good idea to use, to illustrate the concept of opportunity cost with money. Instead, we should use something like you have your own workforce, and you can use it to either produce, I don't know, like to, if you are a farmer, you can use your workforce to produce wheat, or you can use your workforce to produce potatoes. So then it's actually a trade-off between the use of a resource. If you use money instead, it doesn't make much sense to me, since it is not a resource. So I think we should avoid collectively to use this type of example, and instead really think of a decision on how we should allocate the resources. And to conclude this video, let me ask you a question, an interesting exercise that I often ask my students, and hopefully we will find the right answer. Let's say that you have two job offers, job A and job B. And your job is to, well, you have to decide. You have to decide whether you are going to take job A or job B. Job A pays you a pretty high salary. If you take job A, well, a relatively high salary, you are paid $2,000 per month, okay? And job B pays a relatively lower salary. You only have $1,500. But there is a difference between these two jobs, is that the holiday entitlement is different. The job that pays you $2,000, job A, only have 2 weeks of paid holiday. But job B, that only pays you $1,500, has 4 weeks of paid holiday. Okay, so let's assume that you choose job A. So you have the job that pays you $2,000, but you only have 2 weeks of paid holiday. Now the question is, what is the opportunity cost of that decision? What have you given up? So clearly, it seems like you have less holiday, right? You have only 2 weeks of paid holidays instead of 4. So would we say that the opportunity cost of choosing job A is the 2 weeks of fewer holidays that we have? Would it make sense? Well, many people tend to say that, say we have not given up any money, because we actually make more when you choose job A than job B, but we have less holiday. So most of my students, when I ask them this question, they say that the opportunity cost of choosing job A is the 2 weeks of holiday that we lose, basically. But it's wrong. It's wrong because you know what is the definition of the opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative that we give up. So here, the next best alternative that we give up is job B. And the value of job B is $1,500 per month and 4 weeks of paid holiday. And Therefore, the opportunity cost of choosing job A is the entire value of job B, $1,500 and 4 weeks of paid holiday. You should not do some kind of difference between job A and job B. Okay, we get less money, but we get more holiday. This is not how it works. It's the entire value of job B that we give up. Okay? I think it's an interesting example to wrap your head around the concept of opportunity cost. Okay, and that's already 20 minutes, so I think that's definitely enough for today. I just wanted to share these thoughts, and um, it seemed like a good idea to start with the very beginning of the economics syllabus about resources, factors of production, and opportunity cost. And I think these are the most interesting points that I wanted to share with you today. So I wish you all a very good day. And tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, I'll share another video about another part of the economic syllabus and interesting ideas or thoughts that I will share with you. Have a good day, everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.